Once there is this delusion of I, there is the idea of mine, and the process becomes even more complicated. The self in reincarnation. We may wonder, if there is no self, then what is it that passes on in reincarnation? Footnote: Buddhists believe in what has been incorrectly called the transmigration of souls. In reincarnation, an aspect of the mind passes on from one lifetime to the next. There is reincarnation, but this reincarnation is not particularly linked to a self or ego. It is not that there is a self which creates one life after another, so that one develops the idea, I have been reborn, I have been somebody else before I was reborn. But actually, what transmigrates is not the same self. It is not the same I which crops up again and again, or the same I which provokes all these different rebirths. To explain what actually happens, the Buddha taught the idea of interdependence, or what is also called interdependent origination. Interdependent origination explains the arising of one thing from another, how one thing depends upon another for its existence. For example, a flower comes from a seed. There is a seed which makes a shoot. The shoot sprouts leaves, which eventually become flowers. The flower will then create more seeds, and so on. So there is a continuity. But apart from this continuity, there are great differences between the seed and the flower in shape, color, nature, etc. So there is a continuity which is a process of dependence and a process of origination. Change taking place all the time within the context of this dependence. In the same way, ignorance occurs, and because of ignorance, certain actions and activity follow. And because of these actions, eventually, there will be some sort of rebirth. Because of the rebirth, there is aging, sickness, death, and so on. All of these factors are interdependent. One is caused by the other. There is a continuum, but there is not one thing which carries on and on that is unchanging. The Buddha taught what happens from one lifetime to another occurs because of interdependence, not by a self, which is an entity that goes on and on manifesting continuously. To understand this form of transmigration, the fact that there have been so many different karmapas does not mean they are emanations of a self. Footnote: For the last 16 lifetimes, the Karmapa has written a letter before his death stating where and when he would be reborn and giving his name and his parents' name. This letter is opened years after his death and has always been accurate. First, one must examine the deluded idea of self on the level of ordinary people. We think, this is me, this is my one life, and it has been one single life. We think we have a self which is this life. However, when we examine this life, we find everything is changing. We are not in the same physical location, and when we were a tiny baby, we had a body that was only 2 feet tall, later grew to 5 feet tall. The same is true of the mind. When we were a baby, we could not even say our mother's name, and we were very stupid. When we grew up, we learned to read and write, and our mind underwent a tremendous change. We take this me and mine as being ourself. However, when we look at this carefully, apart from the continuity that took place from one step to the other, there is not one thing that stayed the same. Nevertheless, we tend to think of me as though me had been the same all the time. That is how we are deluded about ordinary people and about ourselves. The same is true of tulkas and the great Rinpoches. Apart from the fact that there is a continuity of their noble mind and their activity which benefits beings, there is no self, no constant entity as such, which is continuously present. Because we are deluded, we think of them as being one fixed person. The word skandha is a Sanskrit word for aggregate or heap. and provides an image of a great pile of different things. Because it is a whole heap, we can say this is one pile. But when we examine the heap carefully, we discover it includes many different types of things. Yet from the gross point of view, we globalize and think of a heap as just one entity and relate it to it as if it were just one thing. So when we examine our own existence and what is taking place from one lifetime to another, we can find individual instances of many different things, so many different minutiae. Because there are so many different elements, our gross perception tends to label them as simply I. This process of conceptualizing the skandhas then shows us how this delusion of self occurs. It is like a mountain which consists of many different pieces of dirt and dust. One gives this the name mountain, even though it is made up of millions of different pieces. Similarly, because we have developed the idea of I, we also develop desire, and these desires eventually cause the defilements. The defilements eventually cause suffering. The liberation from suffering, enlightenment, consists in the realization that this I is a delusion, a mistake, and that there is no I or self. Once we have seen through that, there is no more I want anything, no more I to dislike anything, no more I to possess the defilements, and therefore no more negative karma. We shouldn't take the continuity as being a thing. When we have the delusion of a self, for instance, between being a baby and a grown person, so many things change and are different. Yet we have this deluded projection about self, which appears to be the same. We might say that the I has been there all the time, but this is not true because the continuum is not the same as an idea of self. It is not that there is a continuum which carries on in something, which would be another word for self. A continuum, by its very continuity, implies change and difference. So a continuum is tracing the way one thing changes into another and then into something else. We follow through the connection of one thing to another, but it doesn't mean that because there is a continuity, there is something which is the same and present all the time. So with reincarnated lamas, there is just this unbroken Buddha activity. This also happens when one dies. It is true that when one dies, one's body is no longer useful, but one's mind carries on. It is not as though there is a mind as a fixed thing that carries on and on. It is that there is a continuity. One can trace the change from one state of mind to another, and that is what carries on. That mind carries on through future lives, but it is not as though there is a constant thing like a self or a continuum, which is nothing more than a synonym for self. To summarize, impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and absence of ego are the four main aspects of meditation which helps us to realize the truth of suffering. When we understand more about the emptiness of phenomena, we begin to see the absence of ego automatically, and we will have less aggression, attachment, and ignorance. When these diminish, there will be less suffering.